My identity is Lily Adams. I am currently 34 years of age, and exactly 17 days prior to the marriage ceremony of my younger sister, a message arrived from my mother and father containing 5 distinct terms I was required to follow if I wished to have an assigned place inside the celebration hall. It was mandatory that I completely drop every single monetary grievance I held against her, execute a non-disclosure contract, give up all of my personal rights to the estate left by our late grandmother, provide a cash payment of $25,000 to fund the marriage festivities, and deliver a public declaration of regret for fracturing the closeness of our household. At the very conclusion of the message, my father had appended a note stating that if I fulfilled all 5 demands, they would permit my attendance. I reviewed the text a second time, and then I spotted the digital document they anticipated me to execute and return before the clock struck midnight. They were operating under the assumption that this tight restriction on time would induce panic within me. On the contrary, it made the entire situation perfectly transparent. I composed a reply consisting of just 4 words. I rejected every single one of the 5 terms, dispatched the email response, secured a coastal room in Malibu for the exact dates of the marriage celebration, and contacted a delivery agent regarding the transport of one final token. The packaging appeared sufficiently sophisticated for a bride who had transformed her marriage ceremony into a theatrical production for 300 individuals. Inside that container, however, rested an item that she had dedicated the past 2 years, ensuring no living person would ever witness. I was certain she would unwrap it out in the open because she had already instructed the master of ceremonies to proclaim every single high-value offering received from prominent relatives. What she remained completely unaware of was that my token contained no precious ornaments, no currency, and absolutely no expressions of regret. It held a chronological sequence of events, an audio capture, and a solitary legal paper bearing a signature that perfectly mimicked my own handwriting, though it was entirely counterfeit. Before I disclose the words she uttered and the events that unfolded once that container was unsealed, allow me to ask you, what exact hour is it where you are currently located? From what destination are you viewing this broadcast, and what kind of weather conditions are you experiencing at this moment? I am truly interested to observe the distance this account will cover. The very first individual I brought up in that electronic mail was my younger sibling. Her name was Natalie, and throughout the majority of our developmental years, my mother and father regarded her missteps as urgent crises. Every other member of the household was held accountable for resolving her issues. She possessed a highly captivating persona when out in public, was exceptionally swift with pleasant remarks, and had a natural talent for making individuals feel uniquely selected. Inside the household, she evaluated all human connections solely by their practical utility. When she required a monetary guarantee for her university enrollment, I advanced her the funds. When she abandoned a promotional position after a mere 6 months, I assisted her in completely restructuring her employment history and took care of 2 months of her housing costs. When she initiated an upscale promotional firm, I presented her to 3 major patrons from my corporate bookkeeping firm. Every single act of assistance was accompanied by the exact same vow. She would return the balance to me the moment her circumstances reached a point of equilibrium. Her circumstances never reached a point of equilibrium. The vows simply altered their appearance. Our maternal grandmother had recognized this behavioral sequence long before any other family member was willing to acknowledge it. She bequeathed a completely rehabilitated oceanfront property known by the name Mariner's Point to Natalie and myself in perfectly balanced halves, incorporating an incredibly rigid legal proviso that demanded the signatures of both parties for any financial obligations, property transfers, or significant structural modifications. The location possessed immense emotional worth, but it additionally produced a highly dependable revenue stream through small-scale marriage ceremonies and corporate organizational gatherings. I managed the financial ledgers. Natalie took charge of marketing and outreach. That operational setup functioned smoothly until she entered into an engagement with a culinary property designer named Daniel Mercer. He was an exceptionally considerate, highly prosperous individual and was thoroughly persuaded that Natalie had established her enterprise entirely independent of family financial backing. I harbored no negative feelings toward him. As a matter of fact, that reality made the entire situation significantly more painful. Exactly 6 months prior to the marriage ceremony, I detected a loan transaction inside the Mariners Point bookkeeping records that had never received my personal endorsement. The description provided by the financing institution was incredibly ambiguous. And when I questioned Natalie regarding the transaction, she let out a laugh and claimed it represented a brief line of financing intended for property improvements. I formally asked to view the full financing records. She chose to create delays. My mother and father instructed me to avoid generating friction before the big day. Eventually, the financing institution transmitted an incomplete reproduction of the records, and there it was plain as day, a business obligation totaling $240,000 leveraged against the oceanfront estate, displaying what claimed to be my own electronic endorsement. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of this document. I had never given my official sanction for the financing. When I chose to confront Natalie in a private setting, she made no attempt to contradict the fact that she had utilized the funds. She explained that the marriage celebration had expanded significantly in cost, her enterprise was experiencing severe operational cash shortages, and Daniel's upcoming culinary establishment required a temporary bridge funding injection. Following that explanation, she extended herself across my office furniture and remarked, "You possess a 50% stake in an asset of great worth. I required you to behave in a manner consistent with being family." I informed her directly that a forged endorsement did not constitute a familial favor. She rolled her eyes in dismissive annoyance and charged me with harboring envy simply because she was entering into matrimony ahead of me. That very same night, my mother placed a call to me and stated that Natalie had merely committed a minor administrative oversight that could be easily corrected if I would simply sign a backdated agreement of authorization. My father immediately sent a subsequent text communication prompting me to consider how deeply mortifying a formal inquiry would prove for the entire household. I stood my ground and declined. 2 weeks after that interaction, the document containing the 5 terms made its arrival. The non-disclosure contract was not fundamentally concerned with proper etiquette at the wedding. Concealed deep within the text on the 6th page was specific phrasing that completely absolved Natalie, my mother and father, their corporate entities, and the financing institution from any legal accountability linked to previous monetary choices. The demanded public declaration of regret was not intended to restore harmony. It was deliberately structured to make me appear emotionally unbalanced prior to any moment I might legally contest the fraudulent financing. The financial demand of $25,000 would serve to replenish the capital that was already completely absent from the estate's monetary accounts, and completely giving up my half-ownership of Mariners Point would provide Natalie with total mastery over the leveraged asset. For the very first time, I comprehended these terms not as a random collection of personal affronts, but rather as a highly structured strategic plot. They were not truly extending an invitation to view a marriage ceremony. They were demanding that I systematically obliterate the proof of their illegal actions while putting on a cheerful face for the event cameramen. I immediately transmitted the entire collection of documents to my legal representative, and subsequently placed a call to my closest companion, Emma Reed. I had maintained a deep bond with Emma since our time in advanced university studies, and she represented the solitary individual who had explicitly cautioned me years prior that demonstrating fidelity without enforcing personal limits eventually transforms into completely uncompensated servitude. She remained completely quiet and listened without a single disruption. The moment I finished speaking, she put forward a solitary inquiry. She asked whether my true objective was to be fully validated or to be legally and financially insulated. I responded that I required both outcomes. She informed me that I might be forced to determine which outcome took absolute precedence. Securing insulation was the immediate priority. That very night, I initiated a security alert regarding identity theft on my financial records, formally demanded the entire financing repository, and directed my legal representative to officially inform the financing institution that my endorsement on the note was entirely fraudulent and invalid. Following that, I finalized my lodging reservations in Malibu. The holiday trip was a genuine necessity. I desperately required physical separation from the upcoming marriage event and from the specific compliance my household anticipated me to display whenever summoned. However, the token I prepared was equally genuine. Natalie had dedicated months to orchestrating a highly elaborate, pre-wedding presentation sequence in which chosen family members would publicly extend holy wishes and present high-value offerings prior to the unsealing of the main doors for the formal wedding vows. She had even transmitted 2 separate digital communications requesting that I supply an emotionally impactful family retrospective media piece that could be projected onto the grand screen in the ballroom. I came to the conclusion that I would supply her with precisely that item, a definitive record of the exact reality our household had transformed into. Constructed with the absolute highest level of accuracy I typically utilized during a detailed corporate forensic investigation. I harbored no intentions of generating a scene, creating vocal interruptions, or pleading with anyone to validate my position. My strategy was to allow specific calendar dates, monetary wire records, signed documents, and Natalie's distinct recorded utterances to deliver the truth inside the very space I had been commanded to enter without making a sound. Exactly 3 days later, I found myself situated in Malibu alongside Emma, seated at a slender eating surface completely blanketed with financial institution logs, financing exhibits, land registry records, and meticulously categorized color notes. The vast sea was fully observable right outside the glass panels, but I scarcely dedicated a glance to it. Each passing hour brought to light an additional piece of data that made the 5 mandatory conditions feel far less like ordinary familial coercion and much more like an organized operation to obscure an illegal act. The exhaustive financing repository made its arrival ahead of anything else. The electronic endorsement claiming to be mine had been digitally affixed from an Internet Protocol destination physically situated inside Natalie's corporate headquarters. The security validation queries had been completed utilizing highly specific details that only an intimately connected household member would possess, the exact name of the corporate entity that first hired me, the name of the avenue where our childhood residence was located, and the precise month our maternal grandmother passed away. The financing institution had additionally been supplied with a digital reproduction of my official state driver's credential. I distinctly recalled handing that specific reproduction over to my mother during the prior year when she claimed that the household protection representative required refreshed documentation for our files. When I placed a call to her regarding this, she adamantly maintained that she possessed absolutely no understanding of how Natalie had managed to get her hands on it. Her reply was delivered with far too much speed. Emma closely observed the look on my face as I terminated the connection. She remarked that I clearly did not find her explanation believable. I informed her that I no longer possessed any certainty regarding what to believe. That represented the precise psychological toll that no one ever appropriately cautions you about. Uncovering an act of deep infidelity did not immediately transform me into an individual of immense courage. Instead, it caused me to deeply mistrust every single commonplace memory linked to those individuals. I vividly recalled my mother delivering warm food when I was incapacitated by illness, my father patiently guiding me through my initial driving lessons, and Natalie seeking comfort on my living room rug after experiencing a deeply distressing romantic separation. Precious historical memories did not suddenly vanish simply because those exact moments had been strategically utilized to exploit my vulnerabilities. Instead, they became thoroughly corrupted, and that realization was infinitely more agonizing. I unsealed the property ledger and meticulously mapped out the path of the financing capital. A sum of $90,000 had been directly funneled into Natalie's event enterprise. An additional $68,000 had been systematically moved to a business provider designated under the name Mercer Hospitality Design, an entity intimately tied to Daniel's culinary property development. A portion totaling $42,000 had successfully covered early marriage celebration obligations. An additional sum of $27,000 had been routed through the corporate advisory enterprise operated by my mother and father before being sent back down to Natalie under the guise of an innocent family financial contribution. The balance that remained had been entirely drained by administrative penalties and long overdue financial obligations. The reality that Daniel's corporate entity was actively capturing these funds caused me immense concern, but the specific phrasing on the wire records implied a capital contribution that he could easily have been led to believe originated directly from Natalie's personal savings accounts. I did not yet possess definitive proof as to whether he was an active conspirator or simply another individual being systematically manipulated. Right around then, Emma uncovered the very first massive revelation. A hidden ledger located deep within a collaborative data backup explicitly detailed the projected property rights following the marriage ceremony. Natalie had explicitly cataloged herself as the lone executive director of Mariners Point, designated Daniel as an upcoming capital contributor, and placed my name inside a specific column, clearly marked as a completely forfeited asset. The creation date of this ledger was exactly 2 months prior to the moment my mother and father officially transmitted the 5 mandatory terms. Right next to my personal identifier, Natalie had explicitly jotted down the note, "Will signed to preserve invitation." I fixated my gaze on that specific phrasing until the individual letters began to lose their clarity. She had never simply harbored a hope that I would give my consent. She had scientifically determined that I would bend to her will. My enduring tendency to protect the household from public awkwardness had been formally cataloged as a predictable resource on her planning ledger. My immediate impulse was to place a call to her and announce that I had thoroughly uncovered every single detail of her scheme, but Emma intervened to halt me. She pointed out that Natalie had been structuring her strategy entirely around my anticipated emotional responses. She advised me to absolutely avoid providing a fresh emotional response that Natalie could formulate a counter-strategy against. We forged ahead with our analysis. Deep within an ancient repository of saved audio communications, I stumbled upon a specific transmission Natalie had dispatched after consuming an excessive amount of spirits during an out-of-town corporate assembly. At the initial time of receipt, I had completely shrugged it off as just another one of her highly overdramatic, late-night venting sessions. In the present moment, the words carried a radically altered significance. She explicitly stated that our parents were finally managing Lily, and that the moment I affixed my signature to the marriage documents, the massive financial obligation would transform into an asset far too interconnected for me to ever legally challenge, ensuring that Daniel would never be required to discover where the initial culinary restaurant funding truly came from, because he would easily clear the balance following the grand opening. Her spoken tone was entirely light-hearted, borders on completely indifferent. At the very termination of the recording, she let out a chuckle and remarked, "She'll be angry for a month, then she'll fix it like she always does." I cycled through the audio transmission 2 separate times. Upon the second listening, I experienced absolutely no sudden wave of triumphant validation. Instead, I felt an intense wave of self-reproach because a deep part of my consciousness recognized the structural sequence just as clearly as she did. I truly had stepped in to resolve her crises exactly as I always did. I had consistently shielded Natalie from collection agencies, corporate management, former companions, and the profound disapproval of our parents. I had consistently characterized that protective behavior as an expression of deep familial affection, because acknowledging that it actually stemmed from a profound dread of conflict would have forced me to alter my personal boundaries much earlier in life. That exact realization turned into the emotional core around which the entire final presentation was constructed. I harbored absolutely no desire for the media presentation to simply resemble a compilation of deeply embarrassing childhood anecdotes. My explicit goal was to lay bare a continuous sequence of deliberate choices made by adults, highlighting the forged signature, the systematically diverted capital, the deceptive document releasing her from liability, the calculated plan to deceive Daniel, and the coordinated push by my mother and father to guarantee my quiet submission. Together, we constructed a 12-minute media piece utilizing exclusively legal documents and financial records that could be indisputably verified. We intentionally avoided adding any sort of emotionally manipulative or dramatic background tracks, and we completely refrained from including personal slights or insults. Every individual frame on the display plainly demonstrated a specific calendar date, an exact monetary sum, and the verifiable origin of those funds. The concluding slide contained a solitary, powerful declaration stating that a marriage celebration is utterly incapable of establishing genuine human trust when fraudulent behavior has been systematically utilized to force a false compliance. In addition to the media file, I put together 3 completely closed, confidential packets. The first package was explicitly directed to Daniel and held the comprehensive, verified transactional history detailing every single cent that had impacted his culinary establishment project. The second package was explicitly directed to my mother and father, containing the official legal communication dispatched from my legal representative that legally mandated them to preserve all relevant files and records. The final package was explicitly directed to Natalie. Inside her specific packet rested an exact reproduction of the 5 mandatory conditions they had sent me, a copy of my brief 4-word text rejecting those terms, and an official legal demand insisting that she immediately return the stolen capital and fully give up her operational management privileges regarding Mariner's Point. Right on the very peak of these papers, I positioned a brief, handwritten message. It stated that she had explicitly requested a public demonstration of regret, so I was supplying her with a public accounting of the facts instead. Emma carefully reviewed the text and remarked that it felt incredibly cold. I informed her that operating with cold facts was infinitely safer than executing an act of cruelty. The contents of the box would not actively manufacture any artificial outcomes. The presentation would simply strip away the absolute confidentiality that had systematically shielded her from ever experiencing the real-world outcomes of her choices. Even so, During the exact moments I was pressing down the adhesive to secure the container, I found myself deeply questioning whether presenting unvarnished reality out in the open before an audience of 300 individuals represented a true act of fairness or merely a form of castigation. I did not possess a perfectly clean or simple resolution to that question in my mind. I only possessed the clear knowledge that every single conversation we had attempted to hold in private had invariably terminated with intense familial coercion, outright refusal to accept blame, or yet another legal paper being aggressively shoved in my direction. Her carefully managed public persona represented the specific defensive barrier that Natalie treasured above everything else in the world. If my goal was to truly compel her to abandon the utilization of that defensive barrier, I was required to position the unvarnished facts in an environment where a curated persona could no longer step in to override reality. The next major obstacle we faced centered entirely on the method of distribution. I absolutely rejected any notion of quietly slipping into the celebration hall, pretending to be a hired catering provider, or relying on a guest to covertly capture video footage on their mobile device. Fortunately, Natalie had already manufactured the perfect pathway for me. Her professional coordinator had previously transmitted an explicit timeline to every single closely related family member, detailing the legacy offering presentation. This was an event slated for a 40-minute block immediately prior to the wedding vows, intended exclusively for the unwrapping of highly prominent presents. While a high-quality digital broadcast link was actively operating for individuals viewing from remote locations, Natalie had specifically structured this event to put on display the exact lifestyle she desperately desired everyone to look up to and envy. My personal identifier remained explicitly typed out right next to the absolute final presentation position on the schedule, immediately followed by the descriptive phrase, "Sister's tribute video." My mother and father were evidently operating under the total assumption that I would fold under the pressure and comply prior to the expiration of their time limit. I immediately composed an electronic mail to the event coordinator stating that I would be unable to physically attend the celebration, but that I would absolutely fulfill the pre-scheduled media presentation. I attached the completed 12-minute media file to the email, supplied the exact tracking identifier for the physical container, and explicitly requested a written confirmation guaranteeing that the confidential packets would remain securely inside the container until the precise moment Natalie unsealed them. The event coordinator quickly sent a reply stating that Natalie had personally given directives to ensure my presentation was prominently featured because demonstrating a beautiful family reunion was a critical component of the overarching marriage story arc. The sheer level of precise contradiction embedded in that reality was so profound that I came incredibly close to letting out a laugh. My legal representative thoroughly scrutinized every single item and document prior to us shipping the container out. In addition, she formally transmitted a sworn legal statement to the financing institution explicitly contesting the validity of the signature and demanding an immediate, total freeze on any additional capital withdrawals against the Mariners Point asset. We made absolutely no request asking the financial institution to step forward and make an official disclosure throughout the course of the marriage celebration. We were fully aware that such an action was completely unnecessary the exact moment the formal fraudulent activity alert entered into the tracking system. Natalie would instantly lose all operational capacity to draw from the remaining balance of the financing line, and the underwriting institution would immediately initiate direct contact with every single individual listed as a financial backer on the documentation. At precisely 9:12 on the subsequent morning, the phone rang, displaying my father's contact information. He bypassed any form of polite standard greeting. He immediately demanded to know exactly what details I had provided to the financial institution. I responded calmly that I had merely provided them with the absolute truth. He aggressively cautioned me that independent building service providers, event vendors, and the entire structural foundation of Daniel's culinary establishment could suffer severe operational devastation. I put forward the question, asking why my forged signature had been viewed as perfectly tolerable when the entirety of the financial vulnerability and devastation belonged exclusively to me. He stated aggressively, "This situation is vastly more significant than a solitary signature." That specific phrase served to validate infinitely more details than he had ever intended to reveal. I asked him directly whether he had possessed full awareness of the forgery all along. He maintained a complete, dead silence for a duration of exactly 4 seconds, and subsequently stated that my mother had only agreed to supply the state identification copy because Natalie had explicitly promised them that the legal paperwork was entirely brief and temporary. I immediately utilized a legal writing pad to document the exact minute of his verbal confession. I stated, "You consciously permitted her to utilize my personal driver's credential." He sent back a reply claiming that parents are occasionally forced to make incredibly agonizing, difficult choices for the sole purpose of ensuring a household stays bonded together. I informed him directly that households whose bonds are maintained exclusively by unauthorized, fraudulent liabilities were already fundamentally shattered. He significantly dropped the volume of his voice and attempted to put forward a brand new arrangement. He proposed that if I executed the legal waiver, came to the wedding celebration without causing a disturbance, he would personally exert pressure on Natalie to systematically return the entire balance to me over a duration of 5 years. I asked him exactly what tangible asset would serve to legally guarantee those payments. He replied simply, "Trust." I immediately terminated the telephone connection. My mother subsequently attempted to utilize a radically different psychological tactic. She transmitted a series of photographic images displaying Natalie during her early childhood years and subsequently composed a text stating that the choice I made in this moment would serve to define my character for the rest of my existence. I experienced a powerful urge to type out a reply. Instead, I chose to forward the entire message log directly to my legal representative and completely deactivated all incoming communication notifications on my device. Later that same evening, Natalie placed a call to me utilizing a completely restricted, unidentifiable phone number. The very first words out of her mouth were, "Do you possess even the slightest understanding of the exact things you are actively putting at risk?" She adamantly asserted that the financing line was nearly entirely cleared of its balance, that Daniel would experience profound public mortification, and that our parents were facing the total loss of their commercial advisory enterprise. Following that outburst, the tone of her voice experienced a sudden softening. She expressed that she deeply desired to have me positioned right next to her throughout the course of the marriage vows, and that biological sisters should absolutely avoid permitting administrative paperwork to obliterate a truly unique, once-in-a-lifetime celebration. I asked her to state with absolute clarity, without any evasion, whether she had personally forged my name onto the financing papers. She hesitated for a brief moment and subsequently remarked I merely executed exactly what was mandatory for the welfare of everyone. Emma, who was positioned directly across the furniture from me, captured every single word clearly via the speaker system. Natalie pressed forward, stating, "You invariably manage to land safely on your feet." I desperately required a solitary achievement to belong entirely to me. There lay the unvarnished psychological reality. It was absolutely not an expression of deep remorse, but rather a profound sense of personal entitlement, dressed up in the language of emotional suffering. I informed her directly that the physical container was already in the custody of the transit service and was actively moving toward the venue. She let out a loud shout of my name and subsequently demanded to know the exact contents resting inside the box. I responded simply, "Every single fact you were completely confident I would keep entirely hidden from the world." Following the termination of that specific telephone interaction, my hands experienced such an intense, uncontrollable tremor that I accidentally overturned a glass, sending water cascading across the entire surface of the table. Emma refrained from offering any sort of celebratory remarks. She simply quietly stepped in to assist me in drying off the paperwork. On the subsequent morning, we officially arrived and registered at the upscale coastal suite I had secured in Malibu, and I positioned my mobile device directly adjacent to the active digital broadcast system hyperlink. I did not experience a profound sense of personal empowerment. On the contrary, I felt precisely as though I had stepped onto a forward path immediately after setting a massive blaze to the structural road trailing right behind me. At exactly 4 Solokand p.m. According to the local time zone in California, the Grand Legacy presentation event was scheduled to officially commence inside a celebration ballroom situated 3 entire time zones away from where we sat. At precisely 3:47, a text message from the event coordinator arrived on my device. It stated that my package had been successfully positioned directly on the main gift display table. The text further noted that the bride had explicitly mandated that my specific contribution be unsealed at the absolute conclusion of the event. Natalie was still operating under the complete delusion that she possessed the total capacity to orchestrate and dictate the final outcome of the story. The digital broadcast stream officially unsealed, displaying a comprehensive, wide-angle perspective of the massive celebration space. Pristine white orchids were elaborately arranged, climbing up the structural pillars. Hundreds of glowing candles blanketed the individual guest tables, and a massive illuminated metallic emblem displaying Natalie and Daniel's intertwined initial letters cast a bright glow directly behind the main platform. Through the audio system, I could easily distinguish the mingled voices of more than 300 individual guests engaged in active conversation while catering staff moved seamlessly through the crowd, distributing glasses of champagne. For a duration of several continuous minutes, absolutely no major activity occurred on the screen. Following that brief interlude, the designated master of ceremonies stepped forward to extend a warm welcome to every individual present for this exclusive family gathering taking place immediately prior to the formal marriage vows. He explicitly detailed that the marrying couple deeply desired to take this moment to formally honor the specific family structures that had made the execution of this beautiful day fully possible. Emma shifted her position to sit right next to me on the lounge furniture, but absolutely neither of us uttered a single word. One after another, prominent relatives began to step forward onto the platform. Daniel's mother and father stepped up to present an incredibly rare vintage timekeeper. My biological aunt stepped forward to supply Natalie with our late grandmother's precious heirloom pearl hair tool. My mother and father took the microphone to publicly announce that they were providing a massive financial injection to fund the purchasing of the couple's upcoming personal residence. Every single individual offering generated a massive wave of enthusiastic clapping from the audience and resulted in yet another meticulously staged, beautiful photograph captured by the professional media team. Natalie appeared completely breathtaking and brilliant. If she was experiencing any real degree of intense panic or terror as a result of our recent telephone interaction, she was managing to conceal it with absolute perfection. The moment the master of ceremonies finally arrived at the absolute last presentation item on the official schedule, my mother shifted her physical body closer to Natalie and delivered a quiet whisper directly into her ear. Natalie gave a firm shake of her head in response. The master of ceremonies directed a bright smile straight toward the recording lens and announced to the crowd, "Our absolute final presentation honors come directly from the bride's biological sister, Lily, who was unfortunately unable to physically share this space with us today, but who formally dispatched an item of truly profound meaning." A distinct, low wave of quiet murmuring instantly rippled through the entire ballroom crowd. Natalie immediately stood up and walked directly onto the platform before any individual in the room possessed the opportunity to intervene and halt her progress. "My sister and I have absolutely experienced our fair share of personal friction and disagreements," she stated aloud to the room, deliberately adopting that precise, vulnerable, deeply pained facial presentation she invariably utilized whenever her goal was to capture intense public compassion and sympathy. However, I firmly hold the conviction that a day of this magnitude is fundamentally centered entirely on the act of complete forgiveness. A massive round of enthusiastic clapping instantly echoed through the ballroom. My father, however, completely refrained from joining in on the clapping. The physical container was carefully carried directly onto the center of the main platform. It was constructed of beautiful, deeply polished, dark walnut wood and was elaborately secured utilizing a pristine ivory fabric ribbon. Natalie directed a brief glance straight toward the digital broadcast recording lens, behaving precisely as though she were staring directly through the screen at my face. Regardless of the exact item she chose to send us, she stated out loud to the gathered crowd, "I formally receive it with an abundance of deep love." She reached down and completely removed the wooden cover. Positioned right at the very peak of the interior contents was a beautiful silver display frame holding a historical photograph showing Natalie and myself spending time at Mariner's Point back when we were merely teenagers. Right beneath that frame rested a clean envelope that bore the explicit handwritten direction, "Read aloud." She displayed a wide smile, completely and obviously anticipating a public letter of absolute surrender and apology, and immediately passed the envelope straight into the hands of the master of ceremonies. He smoothly extracted and unfolded the solitary sheet of paper. The look on his face experienced a radical, complete transformation the exact instant he processed the very first sequence of text. Natalie quickly extended her hand to physically seize the document back from him, but he had already advanced far enough into the text for the active amplification system to carry the explicit words clearly across every corner of the massive ballroom. He began to enunciate the opening declaration, which was framed to expose the calculated dynamic of exploitation that lay beneath the surface of the entire event. To my sister, the words boomed out into the hushed hall. "You formally made a demand that I completely yield my rightful legal positions, my inherited real estate share, my absolute quietude, and a cash injection of $25,000 as a direct prerequisite to secure a seat at your marriage vows." I flatly rejected this trade because compliance extracted under duress can never constitute genuine human agreement. The entire room dissolved into absolute immobility as the gravity of the text set in. My mother abruptly stood up from her seat, her eyes wide with mounting alarm. Natalie violently tore the document from the master of ceremonies' hands and frantically scanned the subsequent sections. "Deactivate the audio amplification immediately," she muttered under her breath in a panicked whisper. The master of ceremonies cast a deeply bewildered look toward the event coordinator, entirely unsure of how to navigate this sudden crisis. Before anyone could act, the massive display screens bordering the main stage flickered and shifted automatically to initiate the sisters' tribute video right on its pre-programmed schedule. The opening frame projected the 5 mandatory terms in their complete, unedited clarity exactly as my parents had electronically dispatched them to me. The subsequent frame cast a bright highlight over the specific release language hidden deep within page 6, outlining the total legal immunity they were attempting to secure. The gathered guests leaned forward, their eyes scanning the text in real time as a quiet shock began to ripple across the hall. Daniel took several deliberate steps closer to the projection screen, his face hardening as he processed the documents. Natalie ran frantically toward the tech control station to manually disconnect the equipment, but the event coordinator physically stood in her path, asserting firmly that this media piece had been fully sanctioned under the bride's explicit, written sign-off instructions. The third slide shifted the focus to the core financial infraction, displaying the full $240,000 business note, the fraudulent signature, and the internet address tracking back to Natalie's desk. Daniel slowly turned around to face her, his expression mixed with rising confusion and anger. He asked her directly why Lily's name was affixed to a commercial liability of that magnitude. Natalie stammered desperately, claiming that the document was being presented out of context and was entirely misleading. The media piece immediately progressed to the detailed fund routing chart, laying out the exact destination of the capital: $90,000 to her personal firm, $42,000 for wedding hospitality deposits, and $68,000 routed directly into the Mercer Hospitality Design Company. Daniel's physical demeanor experienced a profound shift the exact moment he witnessed his personal commercial venture listed as a beneficiary of these funds. He looked at her coldly and stated that she had explicitly assured him that this specific capital injection had originated entirely from her company's retained operational earnings. Natalie reached out in a desperate attempt to grab his arm, but he deliberately took a step back out of her reach. My father began to aggressively elbow his way toward the stage platform, loudly declaring to the room that private family records were being weaponized completely out of context. Right at that exact moment, the audio capture initiated automatically, filling the space with Natalie's clear, recognizable voice. The speakers boomed with her words, stating that once Lily signed the paperwork, the debt would become too shared to ever contest, and Daniel would never discover the true genesis of the restaurant money. Her sharp, mocking laughter echoed through the ballroom, sounding infinitely more malicious through the grand house speakers than it had ever sounded on my personal computer screen. Natalie stood entirely frozen on the stage, her face completely pale as the realization hit her. Nobody in the audience moved a muscle. Suddenly, she let out an intense shriek, demanding that the technical team shut down the presentation immediately. That vocalization did not reflect a fear of the physical object inside the container. It was the raw panic of an individual realizing that her secret machinations had just been transformed into undeniable public evidence. She grabbed the silver picture frame and slammed it onto the furniture, inadvertently toppling a large floral display. Daniel ignored her completely, picking up the closed folder explicitly addressed to him and pulling out the contents. He began scanning the verified financial routing records and the detailed advisory communication from my legal representative, which explicitly warned him to retain independent legal representation before merging any assets or signing the marriage certificate. He absorbed the first page and then looked back up at Natalie with a look of utter estrangement, as if looking at a complete stranger. On the presentation display, the concluding slide manifested clearly, stating that this full accounting had already been formally delivered to the underwriting institution and relevant legal authorities, and that nobody in the room was being requested to choose a side, but simply to look directly at the verified record. The media file ceased playing, leaving behind absolutely no grand musical score or smiling family photos, but simply a stark black canvas displaying the current date. across the country in the quiet isolation of the Malibu suite. I sat watching my younger sister fully comprehend that the narrative she had so carefully constructed for the public eye had completely shattered beyond her control. The entire ballroom remained caught in a heavy, stunned silence for several moments after the display screen went dark. Then, the room erupted into total chaos as hundreds of people began talking simultaneously. Daniel's father grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him away from the stage. My aunt confronted my mother out in the open, demanding to know if they had truly attempted to force those 5 conditions onto me. Several of Natalie's high-profile corporate clients quietly collected their belongings and moved toward the exit doors, ensuring they captured clear mobile photographs of the financial routing chart before departing. The event coordinator cut the main public audio feed to the digital stream, but my direct pipeline remained operational through a secure backup connection she had provided earlier, allowing me to view the stage clearly. Natalie was weeping intensely now, her voice raised as she screamed to the remaining guests that I had completely fabricated the documentation out of pure jealousy because I could not bear to see her happy. My mother ran onto the platform to hold her, loudly echoing that the records lacked proper context. My father grabbed the microphone to address the remaining crowd, pleading with them to understand this as a small, temporary family misunderstanding. That specific choice of words completely broke whatever remaining composure Daniel possessed. He marched directly into the center of the platform holding the file and asked Natalie to answer him directly whether she had moved fraudulent capital into his enterprise without disclosing its origin. She stammered that her sole intent had been to assist his business growth. He pressed further, asking if she had forged my signature. She defended her actions by claiming I would have eventually agreed to the loan anyway. My mother tried to speak over her to shield her, but Daniel cut her off firmly, stating that he was addressing Natalie. Natalie looked around the room desperately, hunting for anyone willing to step forward and defend her, but for the first time in her life, every single person remained perfectly still. She finally blurted out that she had applied the digital signature because a strict financing deadline was running out, insisting that the underlying value of Mariner's Point made the entire loan harmless and that I had always been an enemy to her success. Daniel flipped to a subsequent page in the file and asked if her written plan to systematically strip my ownership away after forcing a release was also entirely harmless. Natalie's demeanor went completely cold, her weeping stopping instantly as she told him that marriage demanded absolute loyalty and that he should be protecting her instead of interrogating her in front of a crowd. Daniel looked at her and responded firmly that the people present were no longer guests, but formal witnesses to an illegal act. My father tried to step between them, warning Daniel against making a rash choice in a highly charged emotional moment, but Daniel shot back instantly that the defining choice had already been made the exact moment his commercial venture was funded using stolen capital. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the unworn wedding band, and slammed it onto the table, announcing to the entire room that there would be absolutely no marriage ceremony taking place today. The ballroom gasped in unison. Natalie grabbed his clothing, screaming at him to change his mind, but he pulled away completely and directed security personnel to clear a path so he could retreat to a private room to consult with his legal counsel and commercial partners. My mother turned toward the display screen and screamed that I had successfully destroyed my sister's life. Right at that exact moment, the event coordinator stepped to the microphone and announced that there was an incoming live video transmission request from Lily on the main presentation system. I had originally intended to remain completely off-screen, but Daniel had just sent an urgent text to Emma using the number provided in the legal packet, asking if I would be willing to answer 3 direct questions before the gathered family. Emma looked at me, waiting for my choice. I came very close to declining, but then I remembered the endless times my household had constructed false narratives about my character while systematically denying me the right to speak for myself. I accepted the link, and my face appeared clearly on the secondary broadcast screen, bringing a sudden silence back over the chaotic room. I could see Natalie staring up at the screen, her cosmetics completely ruined by tears, her panic completely replaced by pure rage. Daniel stepped forward and asked me to state for the record if I had ever given my authorization for the $240,000 financing line. I looked at the room and said no. He asked if I had ever sanctioned the capital transfer into his restaurant enterprise. I responded no. He then asked if my explicit goal was to force the cancellation of the wedding day. I answered that I had merely contested a fraudulent use of my identity and laid out the facts regarding the origin of the capital, and that whatever choices they made with that information belonged entirely to them. Natalie shrieked up at the screen, accusing me of playing the victim after deliberately engineering the presentation to achieve the absolute maximum amount of public humiliation for her. I looked at her directly and stated that she was entirely correct about the setting. I had deliberately chosen a public forum because every single private setting had been systematically weaponized to force me into silent compliance, and because she had fully intended to utilize my forced presence as public confirmation that the family endorsed her actions. I told her she wanted the screen to display a forced apology and validate a lie. So I gave the room the unvarnished documents instead. My father yelled at the technical booth to cut the transmission feed immediately, but Daniel intervened, demanding that they allow me to finish speaking. I refrained from delivering a long speech. I simply looked at my parents through the lens and asked them to state clearly if they had provided my private driver's license to Natalie. My mother covered her face in shame, and my father stammered that it had been an oversight. I asked if they had bothered to read the legal waiver before demanding I sign it, and he admitted that their lawyer had told them it would protect the family from litigation. That single admission resonated through the ballroom with far more destructive power than any angry accusation I could have hurled. My aunt turned around and confronted my mother directly, stating that they had clearly known all along this had nothing to do with wedding etiquette. My mother dissolved into tears, crying out that they had been terrified that if the loan collapsed, Natalie's enterprise, Daniel's restaurant, and Mariner's Point would all experience total ruin together. I looked at her through the screen and put forward the final question, so you collectively decided that I should be the one to fail quietly instead? Absolutely nobody in the ballroom could find the words to contradict me. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.